There is a common expression that when something is out of sight, it is out of mind. And this is definitely true. We are always obsessed and focused on what is right in front of us, the tasks of today, the tasks of this week, this month, and this year. It is not often that we think beyond something digital into realizing what the physical cost of it is. Yet it's still there, right? We sacrifice our real life, we sacrifice our time, we sacrifice our energy, our output in order to get digital tokens back that we have in a bank account. Money obviously has a physical cost because we are willing to spend the physical cost to acquire money. But yet, people are often willing to ask, what is the cost to me to acquire money? But very few people ask, what is the cost to the world for this money to exist? And so I think it is worth asking the question that very few other people ask, what is the human cost of the money we choose to use? We know precisely what our personal cost is for every hour of work and our hourly salary or wages, but we don't ask what is the human cost of money entirely. And so I want to answer that question by giving an example, thinking about a historical event that everybody has heard about through a slightly different lens that people may not have considered. Imagine you time travel back to the 1860s here in the United States. It doesn't matter if you're in the Union side or the Confederate side. For the sake of example, imagine you live in the United States that is at war with itself in the 1860s. Depending on what side of the country you're on, the North or the South, if that changes what political regime you are currently supporting. Is the Union without fault? No. Is the Confederacy without its benefits? No. But obviously, one of these two entities is promoting an institution that is having a massive human cost. For whatever political reasons aside, the reality is that the Southern Confederate States of the United States of America, right, the Confederate States, are advocating for slavery of human beings based upon the color of their skin and based upon where they come from and for no other reason. During the time of the Civil War, there were about 4 million enslaved men, women, and children living in the Confederacy, and over 700,000 soldiers died. 700,000 Americans died during the war, many from the war itself and also from the infections as a result of injuries due to the war. This was a very expensive conflict, both for the people fighting it on the battlefield, as well as for the people in fields in chains back at home in the South. This is a very brutal war. And so obviously there are many things that impact these different sides of the war. Obviously the bullets on the battlefield, the diseases that would infect the soldiers on the battlefield, and obviously the economics of each side of the war have a real impact. In fact, the main reason why the northern states won when compared to the Confederate states is because of their industry, their massive industry in steel and in all kinds of non-agricultural products, right? They could move troops faster. They were dominant with energy, and that's why they defeated the South. They completely won. The South never had a chance to defeat the North. Their best hope was a war of attrition against the North. And so here is the question. Why is it easy for us to accept that when it comes to steel, when it comes to manufacturing, well, obviously the North had an advantage. There's another component that we often forget, and that is the aspect of currency. That is the aspect of money. It's easy for us to look at what is right in front of us, something that is physical we can touch, but when something is out of sight, it is out of mind, and it's a little more difficult for us to conceptualize the role at which a political currency plays in helping a political regime maintain its political might. As an example, look at the chart here, and you can see the prices of Confederate currency during the Civil War from January 1861 until the end of the war in 1865. There was massive inflation and monetary debasement both in the North and in the Southern states to the United States. In fact, these kinds of debasement would be directly tied to people's perceived belief in the future survival of that political institutions. For example, at the Confederate States' defeat at the Battle of Gettysburg, it caused the Confederate dollar to collapse 20% in value. A barrel of flour cost $8 in 1861 and $750 by 1865. Imagine living in the Confederate States of America. You are a person, or you're a Christian, you're a family man, whomever you are, in the Confederate States in 1861. And I'm here telling you that the nominal price of your goods and services are going to explode by a factor of 100 over the next few years during the war. This is a crisis for you and your family. However, the point I want to make here is that not only is it a personal moral imperative for yourself and your own family to protect your own purchasing power and escaping the Confederate dollar as soon as possible, it is also a moral imperative for all your neighbors and your surrounding community and your surrounding countrymen to escape the Confederate dollar as soon as possible. Because not only are you going to watch the purchasing power of your savings fall by 99% over the next 4 years during this Civil War, you are also allowing the Confederate States of America to retain its monetary premium and therefore subsidize and fund this conflict for even longer than what it is going to otherwise. Now, it is worth noting that the Union side also did the same thing. This is one of the reasons why Abraham Lincoln was very unpopular, especially towards the end of the war. They had greenbacks. They had a lot of inflation, not nearly as much as the Confederate States of America, but they still had a lot of debasement. This is the issuance of greenbacks, causing an 80% price rise for many consumer goods in the North. Abraham Lincoln himself is quoted as saying, "The government must have money. If this paper currency will do it, let us have it." And the point why I bring that up is that this is not me saying that political jurisdiction A is good and political jurisdiction B is bad. Every political jurisdiction has human beings touching and involved within each jurisdiction intricately. I'm not going to sit here and say that the United States of America has done an equivalent number of evils with a comparable intent to that, let's say, of the tyranny of North Korea. But it's possible to criticize different political jurisdictions to different degrees for different things they've done. And so, similar to our example in the Civil War, the question remains, even if all political jurisdictions have some degree of human sin involved in that institution, even if all political jurisdictions have some degree of corruption involved, you can't perfectly remove that. The burden still remains for you to pick the institution that you are subsidizing the least amount of sin and corruption. That is your duty as somebody with a moral conscience. So in a war, you want to protect your family's wealth during the conflict. It is your job to protect the purchasing power of yourself and your immediate loved ones. It's your duty, to ask yourself the question: do you want to be at the will of this state, or do you want to have a physical, energy-backed currency? If you were standing there in 1861, staring down the face of a 100x of political currency debasement from the Confederate States of America, do you want to hold and save your energy in the barrels of flour, or do you want to save your energy in Confederate dollars? It is a practical imperative. You exit the Confederate dollars and you enter into those barrels of flour, because they are not collapsing to zero like the Confederate dollars were. However, again, there is also the additional question of what if removing your families, your businesses, and your church's monetary energy from the state's political currency, the Confederate dollars, into flour is also a question of morality. What if you can reduce the survival of this corrupt political institution by a single day in doing that? You're willing to sacrifice your personal time and energy for the sake of acquiring those Confederate dollars. And so by you continuing to hold those Confederate dollars, you are giving approval, you are giving consent, and you are giving energy to this institution that you do not agree with. Every single day you continue to hold onto these Confederate dollars, you are subsidizing the state-sponsored enslavement of 4 million people, as well as the multi-state conflict, or the Civil War conflict, that's going to cost nearly 1 million American lives. That is what you are subsidizing indirectly when you continue to hold the political currency of this regime. So the question you need to ask yourself is not only what is the purchasing power of my Confederate dollars going to do in the next few years, your other question should be, what is the human cost of me continuing to hold these Confederate dollars in the coming years? If there are a mere 4 million small businesses like myself that are retaining our purchasing power in the Confederate dollars over the coming years, and if there are 4 million people enslaved by this state, is it fair or unfair to say that you retaining your business's earnings in this corrupt political currency is leading to the subsidization indirectly of another person being enslaved, right? These are the questions you should be asking yourself. Not only what is the cost to me, but what is the cost for other human beings in letting this currency retain its monetary premium. Now, I am not saying that you are directly responsible for that. If the state uses those funds, it uses that premium that you are giving it, and it uses that to commit evils, obviously they're the ones directly responsible, not you. We are not responsible for others' evil doings. However, we become complicit when there is a viable alternate that we will willingly ignore. I'm not going to sit here and say that the person that is hoarding Confederate dollars that has no alternate to normal US dollars of the Union or to barrels of flour, I'm not going to sit here and say that they are equally morally responsible for the enslavement of another person as the plantation owner is, right? I'm not going to say that. However, when that person hoarding Confederate dollars has an easy, viable option that is in their incentive to holding those barrels of flour or to exiting into the political currency of the Union, it is their moral duty to do that and exit and starve the corrupt monetary premium of this failed state. The greater the evil and the better the alternate, the closer your proximity and the hotter coals should be that are burning over your head, right? The greater the evil and that is occurring by the state, and the better the alternate you have to exit the state, and the closer proximity you have to understanding to do that, the more weight and the more responsibility and the more urgency you should feel in exiting that political currency. The state itself is not the origin of evil, but every state has advocated, justified, or tolerated evil to some extent because every single human being does that as well, some more than others. And why do we do this? We tell ourselves a lie about this, right? We always say to ourselves that, well, mankind will always use money for sin and destruction and corruption. So all forms of money incentivize that in the same manner, right? But that is simply not true. Sure, the Union did all kinds of things that many would argue be morally reprehensible during the Civil War, right? However, the degree of destruction that the Union was causing is not comparable in many ways to the destruction of the Confederate States, obviously, for the matter of slavery alone, right? And just because we can criticize the evil doings of the United States does not mean that we should sell our American dollars and go fund North Korea's tyranny, right? Every unit of monetary premium we give North Korea causes more suffering than every unit of monetary premium that we're giving to the United States. So just because one state has more corruption than another or has less corruption than another, just because no state is perfect does not mean that we should willingly ignore the moral ramifications of us continuing to hold that political currency. Another lie we tell ourselves is that our individual actions are so small in the grand scheme of things and the massive size of this country or this world that they don't matter and they aren't worth anything. This is a lie, and this is simply not true. You probably have a larger impact than what you can realize. And even if your impact is small, even if your impact is trivial and nobody remembers it, it is still the right thing to do. It does not matter if you selling your Confederate dollars during the American Civil War actually frees somebody who is enslaved. It doesn't matter if it actually prevents one life of one 20-year-old on some battlefield in a state, 1,000 miles away. It doesn't actually matter if it has a large impact or not. What matters is you do the right thing when you have the opportunity to do it. Another lie we tell ourselves is that money is purely logical and practical and that it's not spiritual. However, this is also not true. Everything we do in life is spiritual, especially if you are a Christian. You believe that everything has spiritual ramifications and that God cares about everything we do, not just about Sunday morning, but on every other day of the week. Every thought we have in our head, every desire we have in our heart, and every action we take, everything has a consequence. And so obviously the way we steward our money is really important. The ways we give our money to help others, the ways we save it for our future, and the ways we spend it on the needs and wants of today. Of course, God cares about how we steward our money in every single aspect, not only in the ways that we tithe and give our money to those that are less fortunate. However, there is also an important aspect of stewarding in the kind of money we are using to save into the future. And my argument here is that Bitcoin is the moral case of where to park your personal savings. Every single dollar you hold giving America, the United States of America, a higher monetary premium, you are indirectly subsidizing and funding all the horrible, sinful, or corrupt things that you don't like the United States doing. If you do not support the way that the United States has hurt other people over the course of recent decades, you are being a hypocrite if you continue to hold an excess number of dollars for no other reason than your own purchasing power alone. Exiting from a political system that has human beings involved with it, that has a direct human cost on the world, that is quantifiable, even if we can't determine it exactly, it is quantifiable, right? It is the moral case to exit that system and go to Bitcoin, not only because it's a logical conclusion for yourself and your family, but because it is the logical conclusion for helping others in the world whom you will never meet have a brighter, more prosperous future. The greater amount of monetary premium you are giving a political currency, the greater amount of energy you are giving towards that collective of human beings. It is better and superior to give your monetary premium to Bitcoin instead, so that you can fund a system that does not rely on the weaponization of control and the weaponization of power and manipulation to retain it. I think it's worth noting as well that the whole reason why people enslaved other human beings throughout all of history was to own their economic output. And likewise, monetary premiums to political currencies only survive upon people willing to trade their personal economic outputs in exchange for that political currency they're gaining in exchange. We all, to a certain degree, are enslaved to political currencies because we cannot create our own political currencies. Literally, counterfeiting is illegal. So to a much lesser degree, we are enslaved to political currency. And so it is the moral thing to do to voluntarily exit, sell our Confederate dollars, and even if we only have a minuscule impact, our impact is still the right one to do because we are defunding and demonetizing the state. We are starving the state of its ability to continue on this war of enslaving people to defend its monetary premium. And instead, we are accelerating the ability for a digital state, Bitcoin, that doesn't rely on any central human being to manage it. We're giving that system more monetary premium so that it can survive into the future and we can have a lower human cost. It's not only your practical duty to allocate out of political currency into a political currency. It is your moral duty to exit from political currency into a political currency.